Mark adjusted his tool belt for what felt like the 100th time, though the station's artificial gravity made even that small movement feel like lifting a mountain. The fluorescent lights flickered as he walked down the corridor of the alien research station, muttering to himself about inefficiency in alien wiring systems. He had been sent here as a human engineer, a species considered puny by these towering, intimidating aliens, and he could feel the familiar tickle of nerves crawling up his spine. Not that he had anything to fear from the equipment itself. No, the real danger on this station was something far more combustible. He rounded a corner and froze mid-step. A faint vibration thrummed through the floor, like the entire station was humming in anticipation. Then he smelled it. Not mechanical oil, not the faint tang of ozone from the generator, but something hotter, wilder. Something primal. His stomach twisted. And then he saw her. Zaira stood in the central chamber, every inch of her towering frame radiating energy. Her skin shimmered with subtle luminescence, her posture regal and imperious. She was terrifying and beautiful, and Mark immediately regretted not having a manual for how to survive a mating alien warrior heat wave. His pulse jumped. The room seemed to warp around her. Lights flickered, panels hissed, and a wave of heat made his eyebrows curl. He instinctively took a step back, and tripped over a stray toolkit. Human! Zaira's voice was low and commanding, yet something about the timbre made his knees weak. You have come, willingly? Yes. I mean, no, I didn't. I'm here for the maintenance check. Mark babbled, scrambling to pick up his tools before they melted in his sweaty hands. He wasn't sure if the intense heat radiating off her was literal or a metaphorical aura of dominance. Probably both, he thought, realizing he'd just lost his grip on a wrench. It clattered across the floor, and sparks flew. Zaira's gaze fixed on him, unblinking, unwavering, and he swore the heat from her body intensified with every second he fumbled. She leaned forward slightly, and Mark thought for a terrifying moment that the air itself was bending toward her. She didn't move threateningly, exactly, but the sheer presence of her was enough to make him question why he hadn't just stayed home installing Earth coffee machines instead of wandering into this infernal chamber. You are calm, she said, the words rolling over him like molten lava. Most tremble, scream, or flee. You stand. Interesting. Mark's brain short-circuited. Thanks? He swallowed hard, realizing that in any other circumstance, this was exactly the kind of thing he might have said to a colleague after surviving a particularly bad fire drill. Except this time, his colleague could vaporize his nervous system with sheer proximity. Her alien crew hovered nearby, observing with a mixture of awe and panic. Every other alien had retreated to a safe distance, muttering in clicks and trills that Mark didn't understand, and he was left alone with Zaira. Alone, but far from safe. Mark backed up instinctively, accidentally knocking a small panel off its hinge. Sparks flew. He jumped back again. I'm trained. I know how to, handle heat. Zaira's lips quirked into something resembling a smile. You offer solutions before even seeing the problem. Intriguing. He had no idea if that was a compliment or a prelude to death. The heat radiating from her was rising exponentially. Panels began to melt, lights flickered violently, and a small puddle of what used to be coolant hissed under the intense temperature. Mark's pulse raced. He looked around for a fire extinguisher, a fan, maybe a snowstorm, anything. I have ideas, he stammered, waving a wrench like a talisman. Maybe we cool? Ice? Fans? Venting? Zaira tilted her head, clearly impressed, or confused. Mark had no frame of reference. He was just trying not to combust. You take charge. Boldly. Fearlessly, she said, and her eyes glinted dangerously. Human, you may survive my heat. You interest me. Mark's mind scrambled. He couldn't even survive a normal day in this place, much less the legendary mating heat of Zaira. And yet, somehow, she had decided he was worthy, worthy of standing in the same chamber as her while she radiated literal, deadly energy. His hands shook. His legs trembled. Every instinct screamed for him to run, but running meant certain death, or at least very uncomfortable embarrassment. He did the only thing he could think of. He straightened, squared his shoulders, and lifted the wrench, and promptly dropped it again. Sparks flew, and Zyra's eyes narrowed, but then she laughed, or at least the closest thing to laughter Mark had ever heard from a lethal alien predator. The sound was intoxicating, terrifying, and horribly encouraging. For a moment, Mark realized something absurd. He was now the only being on the entire station who could take charge of Zyra's lethal heat, not through strength, not through combat, but through sheer human improvisation and complete obliviousness to alien mating rituals. And he was absolutely terrified. Yet Zyra, towering and radiant, now stepped closer, her heat washing over him like a living wave, and Mark couldn't tell if he was about to be killed, seduced, or both. And he had a sinking suspicion, probably both. Mark's hands were slick with sweat, his tool belt swinging like a pendulum as he desperately scanned the room for anything that could stabilize Zyra's heat. Nothing looked remotely adequate. Everything seemed designed for normal alien temperatures, not for a situation where the very air vibrated with lethal sexual energy. He glanced around and spotted a coolant spray canister in the corner. Not exactly industrial grade, but it was something. Okay, he muttered, picking it up. Step 1, don't die. Step 2, keep her from melting the station. His knees buckled as Zyra shifted closer, the floor heating under her feet, panels sizzling at the edges. He tried to raise the spray can, accidentally pressing the nozzle in the wrong direction, which sent a fine mist straight into his own face. He coughed, sputtered, and slipped on the puddle forming around him, landing on his backside with a thump. Zyra's eyes widened, and for a terrifying moment Mark thought she would end him for the ineptitude. Instead, she tilted her head, arms crossed, and chuckled, a deep, throaty sound that vibrated through the chamber. Bold, she said, voice low and amused. You endure discomfort. You adapt. Human, you may be stronger than you appear. Mark scrambled upright, wiping coolant from his face, blinking rapidly at her. Yes. Strong in problem-solving. Definitely not weak. Very strong in the, brain. He waved his hands vaguely, hoping she would accept that as some sort of human display of dominance. Zyra seemed satisfied, which only increased his panic because he now realized she would follow his lead, literally and figuratively. He aimed the spray at a vent panel, hoping to redirect some of the heat. Instead, the liquid hit a control console, causing sparks to fly. Zyra let out a pleased sigh, stepping closer, and Mark could feel the temperature rising by the second. Human, you manage chaos. Fascinating, she said, brushing a hand along her armor in a deliberate, teasing motion. Her eyes sparkled with mischief and challenge. Mark swallowed hard. He had absolutely no idea if she was flirting or planning to melt him alive, but he had no choice. Improvisation became his mantra. He grabbed a nearby fan, a portable cooling unit clearly intended for a single alien dormitory, and aimed it at Zyra's towering frame. The wind barely stirred the air, but she flinched slightly, stepping back. Interesting restraint, she murmured. You control the fire, but gently. Mark felt a moment of victory before the fan overheated, sputtered, and quit, shooting sparks that arced toward a loose coolant line. His eyes went wide. Oh! He dashed forward to grab the leaking line, and in doing so, stumbled into Zyra. Their bodies collided, too close, too intimate, far hotter than intended. Mark yelped, trying to untangle himself while she laughed, low and throaty, the vibration almost knocking him over. You are amusing, human, she said, brushing past him as though his panic were a dance move she intended to join. You survive heat. You endure chaos. You intrigue me. Mark's brain short-circuited. His internal dialogue was a frantic mix of horror and confusion. Intrigue you? I'm about to die. Wait, am I supposed to Flirt back? How does one flirt with a lethal alien? He waved a wrench helplessly. Zyra's heat intensified, the air around him shimmering as if the entire chamber were a furnace. Desperation sparked creativity. Mark grabbed a handful of coolant, tossing it over a nearby console to prevent it from melting completely. It hissed, steamed, and caught fire slightly. He jumped back. Zyra clapped her hands, delighted, apparently mistaking his chaotic management for a ritual display of dominance. Human, you control fire, and command attention. You are worthy. Mark blinked. Worthy? He was worthy of what, exactly? Certain death? A romantic entanglement with a warrior who could roast him alive? Before he could answer, Zyra leaned in closer, her body radiating heat that made his knees wobble. He tried to raise his arms in a defensive posture, which only caused her to laugh, a sound that vibrated across the metal floor like rolling thunder. The alien crew hovered at a safe distance, watching the chaos with a mix of terror and fascination. Some murmured instructions in clicks and trills, but Mark couldn't understand them, and honestly, he didn't have time to. Every instinct he had screamed to run, to hide, to cry, to invent a portal back to Earth, anything. Instead, he improvised, waved, sprayed, and tripped in a heroic display of absurdity. Zyra interpreted it all as confidence, dominance, and seduction. By the time Mark realized he had accidentally activated the fire suppression system, steam and mist flooding the chamber and dampening Zyra's heat slightly, he collapsed in exhaustion. Zyra's eyes gleamed, radiant and approving. Human, you adapt. You endure. You survive my fire, and you amuse me greatly. She stepped forward again, brushing her fingers against his shoulder in a way that made him shiver. He hadn't moved, hadn't planned for this, but apparently, he had done something right. Mark wiped his sweaty face and groaned. Okay. I think I'm officially in charge now. He glanced around the chamber. Sparks still flew. Coolant puddled dangerously. And Zyra, towering, radiant, and completely overwhelming, gave him a playful, commanding smile. He had no idea how he had become the one, taking charge, of a lethal alien mating heat, but one thing was certain, the chaos had only just begun, and somehow, he had to survive it, while keeping Zyra alive, entertained, and only slightly molten. By now, Mark was beginning to develop a rhythm of controlled chaos, which was less a skill and more a desperate improvisation that happened to work. Zyra's heat was unpredictable, sometimes flaring suddenly, sometimes simmering just enough to melt the soles of his boots. Each surge forced him to adapt quickly, grab a coolant canister, redirect a fan, shove a fire blanket over a sparking panel, or occasionally leap out of the way to avoid spontaneous steam eruptions. Somehow, he had become the de facto controller of her lethal cycle, a role he had never, ever trained for. Zyra, towering and radiant, seemed thoroughly entertained by every clumsy move he made. Every time he fumbled, she leaned closer, her presence pressing down with a heat so intense it was almost physical. Her eyes gleamed with amusement, and something that made Mark's stomach twist. Was it desire? Admiration? Or the alien equivalent of predatory approval? He couldn't tell, and honestly, he wasn't sure he wanted to. Human, she said, voice low and amused as she brushed a glowing hand against his arm to steady herself during a heat surge. Mark yelped, jerking back reflexively, nearly falling into a coolant puddle. She laughed, the sound rich, throaty, and vibrational enough to make his knees wobble. You endure my fire. You adapt. You interest me greatly. Thanks? Mark squeaked, fumbling with his tools as he tried to stay upright. He had learned that direct eye contact was hazardous. The heat seemed to intensify when he looked at her too long. Instead, he focused on the nearest vent, the dangling wiring, and the glowing panels. I'm just trying to, survive. She tilted her head, eyes sparkling, and leaned so close that the warmth from her body brushed against him like a living furnace. Survival, yes. But your creativity, amusing. Bold. You command the fire, without fear. Mark wiped his damp forehead and muttered under his breath, "I think she's flirting with me while trying to cook me alive." He scrambled to adjust a cooling panel that was melting rapidly, only to slip slightly and stumble against Zyra again. This time, they collided more deliberately, chest to chest, his flailing hands landing on her armor as he tried to regain balance. She caught him with ease, steadying him effortlessly, and smiled down at him, eyes alight with a mix of amusement and challenge. The alien crew watched from the perimeter, some whispering in cliques, others fanning themselves and stepping back cautiously. Their leader Zyra had never allowed anyone so small, so puny, so apparently helpless to get this close and survive. And yet here he was, tripping, slipping, spraying coolant in wild arcs, and somehow keeping her heat contained without the slightest clue of what he was doing. Comedy and tension intertwined perfectly in a spectacle of absurdity. Mark took a deep breath and attempted to give her some guidance, pointing at vents and switching panels like a frantic conductor. "Okay, maybe fan now. No, coolant. Wait, oh no, not that one." Sparks flew from a panel he had accidentally short-circuited, steam hissed around them, and he lunged to redirect it just as Zyra shifted toward him, heat intensifying. She laughed at his frantic movements, brushing against him deliberately, testing boundaries he hadn't realized existed. "Human, you endure more than most of my kind," she murmured, her voice low and vibrating in a way that made his heart race. "You survive my fire and amuse me at the same time. Fascinating." Mark's internal dialogue was a jumble of panic and exhilaration. Amuse her? Survive her? Keep her from melting the station? Don't die, don't flinch, don't. Oh no, she's smiling while brushing against me again. He grabbed a fire blanket, waving it awkwardly in front of her, hoping to redirect some of the heat, but instead it draped over both of them as she leaned in, curious. Mark's face flushed, part from embarrassment, part from literal proximity to lethal warmth. The ridiculousness of the situation was not lost on him. He was a tiny human, soaked in coolant, tangled with a towering alien warrior in the middle of a chamber threatening to melt down, and yet he was somehow holding his own. Zyra, clearly impressed, pressed a hand to his chest as if testing his resilience, and he froze. His mind raced. Don't flinch, but don't combust either. Somehow, in this chaotic mess, a bond began to form. Every accidental slip, every misplaced hand, every improvised cooling attempt was teaching them about each other. Zyra began to trust him in a way no alien had ever trusted anyone. Mark, despite his terror, found himself drawn to her confidence, her raw power, and the absurdly intoxicating warmth that made everything around them shimmer. By the time he managed to stabilize one of the panels, barely, Zyra leaned in close enough that he could feel her breath against his neck, hot and teasing. "Human, your persistence, your chaos. I find it enticing." Mark could only manage a squeak and a nod, fumbling to adjust a cooling nozzle. Somehow, he realized that the chaos wasn't just a danger anymore, it was a strange, exhilarating intimacy. Every misstep, every panicked movement, every accidental brush against her radiant body was a language they were learning together. The alien crew, meanwhile, watched in silent awe, occasionally muttering commentary in cliques. Mark had become their improbable hero, the tiny, flustered human who not only survived the lethal heat but seemed to command it in ways no alien had dared. Zyra's heat surged again, and Mark, heart pounding, instinctively braced himself, accidentally pressing himself closer to her in the process. She laughed, eyes sparkling with approval, and the bond solidified, chaotic, hilarious, and dangerously intimate. The chamber shuddered as Zyra's heat reached its apex, waves of scorching energy radiating outward, threatening to overload circuits, melt metal, and vaporize anything foolish enough to remain in the open. Mark's heart hammered in his chest. This was it, the moment he had been scrambling toward, improvising through chaos, and somehow surviving. He had no idea what he was doing, but instinctively, he knew he had to take control completely, or everything would be destroyed. He grabbed the nearest cooling unit, a portable industrial fan that looked barely able to handle a human-sized room, let alone a lethal alien heatwave, and shoved it toward Zyra, adjusting the angle with trembling hands. Steam hissed around them as her radiant heat clashed with his pitiful human contraption. Sparks flew from overloaded panels, and a small coolant puddle hissed furiously underfoot. Zyra's eyes followed his every move, glowing with admiration and mischief, testing his limits, gauging his reactions. "Human, you command fire," she murmured, her voice vibrating with warmth and amusement. "You endure chaos, and survive it. Fascinating." Mark swallowed, wiped sweat from his forehead, and waved his arms, desperately trying to direct her heat away from the most sensitive equipment. In doing so, he stumbled forward, tripping over a cooling hose and pulling it straight into Zyra's path. She laughed, a deep, rolling sound that made his knees weak, brushing against him as she steadied herself. The collision brought them chest to chest, close enough that he could feel her heart pounding like a drum against his own. "Oh no, oh no, oh no," he muttered under his breath. His panicked fumbling somehow triggered the fire suppression system, flooding the chamber with a fine mist of water vapor and coolant. Zyra hissed slightly as the temperature around her dropped, and he froze, expecting her wrath. Instead, she tilted her head, the corner of her lips quirking in approval. "Human, you adapt. You endure. You control my fire perfectly." Mark blinked. Perfectly? He had accidentally tripped a valve, drenched himself, and nearly electrocuted both of them in the process. And yet here she was, praising him like some kind of hero. His internal dialogue screamed in disbelief. "I'm perfect. For surviving? For chaos? Or for her?" Before he could answer, Zyra leaned even closer, heat radiating off her like a living flame. Mark's hands shook as he tried to readjust the cooling hoses, but his trembling only caused them to slide against her body, brushing her in ways that were both accidental and intimately close. She laughed softly, interpreting every clumsy movement as deliberate, dominant gestures. Mark's face burned, not from heat alone, but from sheer embarrassment and the intensity of her gaze. The alien crew, still watching from a safe distance, murmured in clicks and trills. Some fanned themselves, others hid behind consoles, but all of them were utterly captivated by the display of human ingenuity, courage, and chaotic charm. Mark had become more than a technician. He was a spectacle, a hero, and an object of fascination for a lethal alien warrior. Zyra's heat began to fluctuate, dipping and surging as if testing his reactions. Mark instinctively adjusted the cooling panels, redirected vents, and grabbed whatever tools he could reach. He slipped, fell, and twisted, but somehow each accidental maneuver worked in his favor. The heat lessened just enough to prevent disaster, though the chamber still radiated an almost unbearable intensity. Zyra followed his movements, playful, teasing, and utterly captivated by his persistence. Finally, after what felt like hours but could have been minutes, the chamber stabilized. Sparks had died down, panels cooled, and the intense waves of heat dissipated. Mark collapsed on the floor, drenched, exhausted, and utterly humiliated, while Zyra stood before him, radiant, glowing, and completely enthralled. She extended a hand, brushing it against his shoulder in a gesture of approval and something more, something dangerously intimate. "Human, you take charge," she said, her voice low and velvety. "You survive and lead through my fire and chaos. You are worthy." Mark gulped, nodding, and for the first time felt a strange mixture of triumph, terror, and exhilaration. I guess I did it," he muttered, still panting, still dripping, and still trying not to faint from proximity to lethal alien warmth. Zyra's laugh, low and throaty, vibrated against him. "Yes, you did. Human, you endure. You survive. And you amuse me greatly." She stepped closer, so close that the heat from her body washed over him like a living flame. Mark could feel her heartbeat, her warmth, her power, and, terrifyingly, her intent. For a moment, the world seemed to narrow to just the two of them, the small, flustered human engineer who had survived the lethal heat, and the towering, radiant alien warrior who had tested him, teased him, and ultimately accepted him. He realized, with a mix of disbelief and exhilaration, that he had not only controlled her heat, he had earned her trust, her respect, and her dangerous, intoxicating attention. The chamber erupted with cheers from the observing crew, some in clicks, some in exclamations, all impressed with the human's improbable heroism. Zyra turned to them, then back to Mark, a playful smile on her lips. "Human, you are mine! For now, and perhaps for longer." Mark's mind froze. Mine? She's literally lethal. And yet, here I am, alive, and apparently desirable? He gave a weak nod, still catching his breath. Zyra laughed again, brushing a hand down his arm, and Mark realized with both horror and thrill that he had survived, commanded, and somehow won the favor of the most dangerous female on the station. The absurdity of it all hit him, a tiny human, dripping with coolant, covered in sparks, standing victorious over an alien heatwave, and yet utterly intimate with the warrior who could have fried him on sight. He laughed shakily, wiping sweat from his brow, and Zyra joined him with a soft, amused sound, warmth and electricity in every gesture. The bond was set, chaotic, dangerous, hilarious, and undeniably intimate. Mark had taken charge, survived the lethal heat, and somehow navigated a path through flirtation, comedy, and chaos that no human had ever imagined possible. And as Zyra leaned closer, brushing against him again, he realized with equal parts fear and delight that this was only the beginning.